Welcome to the channel. Hey, thanks for checking out the channel. Today we're going to build the HRD Industries end-fed half-wave kit. This is going to be a very simple build that's only going to take a few steps. The first step we've already completed, unboxing everything and making sure we have everything. A cinch elastic cable, 2 zip ties, about 5 feet of magnet wire, a large toroid, a wire winder with the SO239 connector installed, random hardware for your counterpoise posts, a ring connector, heat shrink tubing, 1 capacitor, and you'll probably even get a cool sticker. And you might have purchased the kit with the Kevlar wire. If you did, you should get at least 75 feet of Kevlar wire. We're going to put that to the side right now. And we're going to keep things as simple as possible today, meaning we're going to try our best to stick to only the antenna build and tips and tricks in there. If you should have any questions, check out my playlist where I have a video series on different end-fed half-wave related things. So we're going to start off the easiest way I know. Since we've already unboxed everything, we're going to wrap the toroid. All we need is the toroid and this magnet wire for right now. And let's watch this video. Pictured in black, we're going to see our toroid. And what I'm drawing now in red is what we're going to call our first 2 turns, our primary turns. And they'll be intertwined with our secondary turns for the first 2. After 2, we're going to continue on with our secondary wires, and we're going to count turns on the inside of the toroid. After turn 7 will be turn 8, where we're going to cross over on the toroid, and we're going to continue wrapping the toroid until we get to turn 14. If this doesn't make sense quite yet, don't worry, because I'll visually show you in just a moment. But after turn 14, we're going to have and connect our antenna wire. Next up, we're going to focus on the area around the SO239 connector. And again, we have a primary and a secondary, well, 2 of them. And the primary and secondary that I'm drawing out right now will eventually go to the counterpoise wire. And let's just draw our SO239 right here. So in purple, we have what I'm calling the outer shield. And in gold, we'll have our inner shield. Our first set of primary wires and secondary wires on the right-hand side, they will eventually connect to that outer shield. And right now we're going to take one of those other 2 wires, the primary and secondary on the left-hand side. One of them will go to the inner shield. So now we have wires connected to the inner shield, and we're connecting our wires in yellow to our counterpoise or our outer shield. And once we get those 2 wires connected to the outer shield, we're putting a capacitor in line between the outer shield and the inner shield. What you just saw was an idea of how to wrap this toroid right here, and there's no secret, to be fair. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out about 9 inches here. Okay, and after I measure 9 inches, I'm going to fold it over. Okay, so now I have 2 pieces. I have a loop in my right hand that goes to 2 open ends. One's extremely shorter than the other. These 2 wires here that are together are going to make up my primary and my secondary for the first 2 turns. And so the reality is I really probably don't even need 9 inches, but you have plenty of wire. At least 5 feet came with this kit. And see what I'm doing with my left hand is I'm holding the 2 pieces of wire together. And with my right hand, I'm just twisting the primary and the secondary wire together. So they kind of have a nice little twist to them. Okay, and we don't need to go all the way up to the top because, again, we're probably going to end up cutting this. This brings us to our next step. We now have 2 wires twisted together for approximately 9 inches. And then, of course, we go on to just our secondary wire. It's an independent wire. Notice it's all part of the same wire so far. We haven't cut this end or anything. Okay, and then this independent secondary wire will eventually go to the antenna. And what we're going to do to get started here as far as winding the toroid goes, we're going to start with our primary and secondary first 2 turns. And I'm going to go backwards on this. So I start with the toroid in my right hand, being mindful that this magnet wire can scratch against the surface of a somewhat sharp toroid. We don't want to scrape away too much enamel because if we do, we might short out our magnet wire here. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring this up. And so I came up from the bottom side of the toroid and I'm going down until I get, let's just say, a couple of inches of primary and secondary still looped around, as you can see here. And then as I go up, I'm just going to turn around. Now, earlier I mentioned that every time we go around a turn internally, that's 1 turn. So right there we have 1 turn on the primary and 1 turn on the secondary. And you'll see I do have a lot of extra primary wire left over. Rather, that should be primary and secondary, but I'm just going to continue to loop on the inside through the bottom up to the top. And now we should have 2 turns. One of the things that we want to point out right here is it's always important to keep your magnet wire nice and neat against the toroid. And this could affect things like your overall readings once you're finally to that point. And so I'm just trying to keep this kind of tight. Also, one of the things we never want to do is we never want to cross over any of the wires. So we don't want our magnet wire to cross over here and call that a turn, because again, it will affect our overall readings. This is going to eventually go out to our counterpoise wire, as we mentioned earlier, but we're going to leave that for right now, and we're going to continue to wrap. Now, we're at this point where we have 2 wires, one of them's open, and that's the wire that's going to go into the SO239. Very simple, right? And then obviously the rest of this wire, we're going to continue to wrap. So you might see me unwrapping a little bit here. It's not a huge deal, but I'm just basically unwrapping to the toroid, or the edge of the toroid. And then I'm going to continue on counting my turns. If I didn't, I would be happy to send you one, but I just thought this would be pretty easy. And basically it's zip tying our first turn on the primary and secondary together. And that will allow us to keep everything kind of tight and neat as we continue to turn. So I just zip tied that. If you don't have it, it's not required. But again, I'm just trying to keep things nice and neat here and as close to the toroid as possible. Now I have this really long wire here. Again, this short end that just kind of ends is going to go into our SO239, which means this really long wire is going to be the rest of our wrap that's going to go into our antenna wire. And as I mentioned, we have 2 primaries and 2 secondaries. So this is turn 3 and turn 4, turn 5. I'm trying to keep these equally spaced, and also, again, being mindful that we're not crossing over internally. Turn 6. And I believe we're on turn 7 right now, but I'm going to go ahead and just count to confirm. Again, 1 turn, 2 turns on both the primary and secondary. And then for the secondary, that's our 3rd turn, 4th turn, 5th turn, 6th turn, 7th turn. Which means, and we're not crossing over. And that means also, though, that this is turn 8. So we're going to come up from the bottom, and then we're going to go through the top of the toroid internally. Once we go through the top of that toroid, instead of coming back up on that same side, we're going to cross through the middle, come under, and we're going to wrap up, which will bring us into turn 9. And I'll show that to you here in just a second a little bit better. There it is. We have our crossover. I'm going to maybe move that over just a little bit more. And that's 8. And then this right here is 9. Going to continue on until we get to 14, and I'll see you then. And there we are. Again, this is supposed to be an easy tutorial and walk you through everything. So I do want to point out 2 on the primary, but also that's 2 on the secondary, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have 8, which crosses over right here, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, as you see right here. Being mindful, and it gets really tight at 14, being mindful not to cross over that middle crossover itself. And now we have wrapped our toroid. Let's set that to the side for just a second and pull out our wire winder. If you purchased one of the full kits to include the kit with or without the wire, then you would have gotten one of these posts. And this posts are just a series of hardware for our counterpoise wire if we choose to use a counterpoise, which I would recommend. And that's what we're going to hook up next. We're going to hook up our counterpoise to our post, and we're going to do that with this toroid. Before I go into all of this, though, let's just draw this out again. Started again, we're going to just draw our SO239 connector. Let's put a gold or yellow adapter in the middle for our inner shield again. And we're going to have our counterpoise, we're going to call it a lug. We're going to have our counterpoise lug over here, as well as the little clip that hangs off of the outer shield of the SO239. And all we're going to do with our toroid is we're going to take our leftmost primary and secondary, or the one that is still looped, and we're going to go through that little eyelet on the tab for the outer shield. We're going to do that with both the primary and the secondary, and that's the first step, but we also need to include our capacitor. Our capacitor, as we mentioned earlier, will connect our inner shield, as we're calling it, to our ground lug, or our outer shield, as I called it. And let's just utilize some kind of green here for it. This being the capacitor, one leg will connect here and one leg will connect to that outer shield tab. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now, I've done this in the past, so that's why I caution you, but I'm going to cut this zip tie right now so that I could arrange the toroid onto the winder. When I cut the zip tie, I need to be very mindful of all those magnet wires that are in there so I don't cut any of the magnet wire. And now, with the magnet wire gone, we're going to arrange this toroid onto the wire winder in a spot where the SL239 connector will meet the magnet wire pretty much straight on. The rest of this, like the antenna section, and like the counterpoise wire, we'll be able to adjust that slightly. Again, our key is not letting anything cross over, but I feel like right there is going to be a really good spot for this toroid to sit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take two zip ties and I'm going to put them kitty corner from each other, one right here and one right here. I'm going to zip tie them down or tighten them down, but not fully, so I'll have the opportunity to move the toroid slightly if I need to. When I put the zip ties in, my goal is to not take that crossover wire and pull it anywhere. So basically, I don't want to take that crossover wire and pull it to this side or that side of the toroid, thus creating further issues. There you go. It should look something like that. We have our two zip ties on here, and I put the zip tie nubs on the bottom so that when I tighten them, they should recess slightly up into the toroid area. All that's done, so let's go back to focusing on this ground lug. And we have our primary and our secondary that are looped together. Right now we need to cut this to the accurate size. For what I call the outer shield lug or the counterpoise ground lug, I'm just going to find a spot that's slightly above the winder, like where my finger and thumb are right now, and I'm going to cut right there. It could stay twisted for right now. Now I'd rather have too much wire than too little wire, and that's why we cut long. Really, we're only going to need to go to this outer shield or this ground lug tab right here. And so what you see me doing is you see me kind of tucking the toroid to keep it tight. And then I know that I'm going to sand both the primary and the secondary magnet wire right where my fingers are. Okay, I'm going to sand enough so that I can create a good connection between that outer shield or that ground lug and those two pieces of magnet wire. So I'm going to sand this away. And the only other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in one side of this capacitor. Kind of like that. Of course, now I'm going to solder it, but I did want to point out that when I sand these magnet wires away, I want to be able to see that gold exposed. A lot of people might use something like a knife to scrape the magnet wire away, and I guess that's fine, but you got to be careful because you guessed it, if you scrape too much with those razor thin, with those very sharp razor knives, you might actually cut the magnet wire and then have to rewrap the toroid. So now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to take some solder right here on the outer shield. With those three wires soldered onto the ground lug, I'm now going to take this ring connector. I'm going to get a piece of magnet wire inside of it, and I'm going to have it come out just enough so that I can connect the magnet wire to that outer ground lug as well. And to do that, I might need to cut just about half of this heat shrink tubing off. And it's always great to be resourceful, so I have a piece of that extra magnet wire from earlier. I'm going to go ahead and utilize that. And I'm going to scrape away, again with sandpaper, each side just a little bit. So maybe I cut this much off to start, and I'll sand away a little bit on each side. The magnet wire should be able to fit ever so slightly through that ring terminal, and we want it to pop out just a little bit. What we're going to do is we're going to put our soldering iron under the ring connector, and we're going to let the solder flow into that general area. Something that I like to do kind of in between every step is I like just to check continuity where it should go and where it is. So I'm on the ring connector here, and at the end of the terminal here, it's still hot. And I know I need to scrape away probably a little bit more on this side, but I do have continuity. If it's feasible to get a snippers in there, you can go ahead and clip this excess wiring from the primary, secondary, and capacitor. And then let's go ahead and install that ground lug. And well, if you don't have a rework station or a heat gun, maybe a lighter, but now's probably also a good time to go ahead and use some of that heat shrink on this very small magnet wire. And it probably won't shrink to the whole size of the magnet wire, but we're going to reduce it as small as we can. I have removed, or rather loosened, the counterpoise post nut so that there's some play here. The reason I did that is now when we go to put this counterpoise ring connector on, you'll notice it's really tight. And for me, it's because I soldered a little bit extra into the ring connector area, which reduced the inner diameter size, and it just kind of leaves for a nice snug fit. So we're not worried about a loose connection at all. Once it's kind of on there, I'm just going to hold it into place, and then I'm going to screw in the post from the bottom. When you finally do get everything installed, it'll look kind of like that. And the nice thing is then all you need to do is put the wing nut on. If you do choose to use a counterpoise wire, you could use a counterpoise wire off of this post with a fork terminal so you don't always have to remove the wing nut. And I just wanted to point out that it might look like these are hitting, and they are close, but they're not hitting. Now that I have the ring connector on the ground lug, we have this extra wire that we need to connect to the ground tab, if you will, of the SL239. And so I actually slightly moved and bend the tab for the ground lug back just a little bit. That does two things. It allows me to solder on this ground lug or this counterpoise lug for the ring connector. It also shifts the dynamic of where the capacitor is so that I don't have to have a long capacitor. It's just a short jump capacitor. We'll cut some of this extra stuff once it goes into the SL239. Right now, though, let's continue to focus on our last step for the counterpoise wire, and that's soldering on this wire right here. Go ahead and cut as much as you need to cut off right here, and then solder on that wire. Again, making sure that you've stripped away the enamel wire. You know, the fun thing about kits, and I'm going to leave this in for right now, but that soldering job might not be the best soldering job in the world. Regardless, it connects the primary and the secondary to the ground lug, to the ground ring connector, and then also the capacitor. You know, don't get too down on yourself, and if you're continuing to learn, there's always room for improvement, and that's the best thing about learning. And so I just have that down there now, and what I'm going to do is I cut enough wire on the capacitor to fit the capacitor into the SL239 connector. The capacitor is going to go into the SL239 connector, but also this magnet wire here, we want to cut off just enough so it can go into the SL239 connector and then sand it off before we put it in there and solder it. It should look like this. It's difficult to show it on the screen here, but basically I have enough solder to fully go into this post here, which gives me a good connection. And the best way for us to know how good our connection is to test everything out. After all, we've now built the auto transformer of this end-fed half-wave kit, meaning we should have continuity everywhere. We should have continuity between the inner shield and the outer shield, and we do. And that's because we have this loop at the ground post. We should also have continuity between the inner shield and the antenna port. The antenna port is this wire here. I'm just off screen. We do, and then the outer shield as well. We do. And then, of course, our ground lug, but we have ground lug connection everywhere else, so we should be good. Yep. We have continuity between every spot on this end-fed half-wave kit, and that's what we want to see. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these down, but there is probably one thing I want to check, triple check right before we do that. I don't have any of these crossings crossing over. Again, there's no crossing over. The only one you might see kind of crossover is going to be the one that goes into the SL239 connector. But otherwise, there's no crossovers. Internally is the most important part. I don't see anything that looks like a great wrapped toroid. We've confirmed that there's 14 turns, because if you do more turns or less turns, you're adding or gaining impedance. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these down. All right, recessed slightly now as those tightened zip ties. And again, everything looks really good. One thing I do want to point out, I made a video a while back, and I'll link it below, but that video shows how you could test your end-fed half-wave at this point. It involves taking essentially 2,450 ohms of resistance and putting them in between the antenna and crossing them over to the ground post, and then checking your SWRs or your impedance values with an analyzer. That video, watch it, do that testing, and come back here to finish the build. But there's not too much we need to finish with the build. The only things we need to finish with the build are to put on our cinch cable, the elastic cable, and now's a good time to do that. Oh, and then we'll come back and we'll install the antenna. Although it might be a tight fit, what I did is I took the open end of the cinch cable and I brought it from the top down. This gives me the red tab toward the top of my end-fed half-wave winder. Now, when I'm on the bottom, I'm going to take that open end, I'm going to cross over the winder, and I'm going to go back through that other slot that I made for just for this. And then all of a sudden, I'm covering those nubs, so I don't even have to worry about getting scraped up. It's kind of nice. But the theory now is if I did it the correct way, after I wrap the wire, I should be able to go across both ends of the wire, and then it'll be a very tight fit, but I should be able to snap this Velcro into place. So go ahead and just get to this point right now, and then we're going to worry about our wire. We're almost done. It's going to be great. Kevlar wire could be very difficult to work with, and that's okay because it's also so reliable that it's kind of worth it. But basically, I'm able to strip away the outer shield without issue. I'm just using some Quinn wire strippers here. And that gives me and exposes to me fiber strands, or Kevlar strands rather. And also in those Kevlar strands are some electrical wires. They're sharp. They could poke you, so be careful. But basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to separate as well as I can the Kevlar strands and the electric strands. Once I do that, I need to cut these Kevlar strands. I got these Quinn scissors here. They're oversized, but they work so well. Almost cut the wrong stuff. And then there you go. So now all I'm going to do is I'm going to fish this Kevlar wire through the strain relief, starting to the bottom up, then going down, and then meeting back up. What I'd like to do here is I'd like to put on, at least cut this in half, the heat shrink tubing. And I like to put it right onto the Kevlar wire. Now, when I do finally solder on the Kevlar wire to this magnet wire, I'll be able to adjust this wire through the strain relief down until I have a nice tight fit here. If I push the magnet wire back, the potential is I'm going to loosen up the turn internally. So basically I work on the tension on the magnet wire. When all is said and done, it should look like this. And also don't forget to scrape away some of the magnet wire where you're going to solder. Pretty much like that. There is a good connection there, and we can confirm that by using our multimeter to the end of the Kevlar antenna wire. After we confirm the continuity, we can go ahead then and take this heat shrink and shrink it up. I take the strain relief and I can pull it down. There is a little bit of a bend here in the strain relief, but it should be all right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fish this up. It keeps that magnet wire tight. Our last step then is for us to wind up our wire. Those cinch straps should go on the inside of your Kevlar wire or your antenna wire while you're wrapping, just like you see here. Too easy, too easy. So now I take my cinch wire. It's going to be a tight fit, but I put it through the bottom portion, and that allows me to pull a little bit of tension there to keep my wire nice and secure. Hey, just for fun, before we end this episode, because this is built now, we will go out and tune it in the future. And there are people out there who are probably saying, like, why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you mention that? This is the most simple build for an end-fed half wave that I could think about explaining. So if I miss something very technical, maybe it's in that playlist I mentioned already. But also, I don't think it needs to be overly complicated for a beginner to make an end-fed half wave. Let's check out this. See here, and there are a lot of things that you could improve on this. I'd love to see it. Also, you could download this winder, you can print it, and you could resell it with attribution if you'd like. Again, I have continuity set to auto so we could hear it, or to audio so we could hear it. Good. We might need to strip away just a little bit of this wire right here. Good. And outer. Good. And then ground posts. And ground post to inner. Good. We're good there. My objective today was to get out there and make a video on how to build an end-fed half wave using my kit, the HRD Industries Dudetenna. And I feel like I reached the objective. I feel like I did step by step, and it should be easy to follow. There shouldn't be too many hangups. Now, you'll notice there wasn't a lot of theory, because my thought is you jump in here, you build this, you want to improve on it, you want to learn things. After you build it, you can kind of start to get a feel for how things work. Again, it's like taking the ham test. Some people study and study and study and actually understand it all before taking the test. And some people memorize, take the test, and then they learn as they go along. I'm definitely that kind of learner. So, well, maybe you noticed it as we did this build today. I hope that this helped you. Now, again, I want to reiterate, I do have some end-fed half-wave playlists below that show you things like checking 2,450 ohms. And here in the very near future, we will go out and we will trim this wire. Well, this wire is already trimmed, and I know it is. But I want to show you that video so you get an understanding, because the truth is, I say there's 75 feet of this Kevlar wire. There may be a little bit more or just a tad less depending on. So I don't want you to be like, oh, it's 66.5 feet that I need for a 40 meter end-fed half wave. Cut 10 feet and still not be resonant and wonder what's going on. We'll get to all of that in the next video, which should only be a couple of days out here. But if you feel like you could tune your antenna, just remember, it's always better to leave a little bit long than to cut too short and have to add more on later. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you take care. Thanks for at least considering this kit. Have a good one. Ham Radio Dude, 73.